I'm quite pleased to see so many people. It's very... Well, welcome to my talk. So, during the last few years, we've been trying to make the Odoo framework better to program, better to use as well. My part is the better to program part. And of course, the more features you add, at some point, the slower it gets, or it feels slower at least. And so once in a time, we somehow slow down the pace at which we add more features, and we think, can we make it actually faster? Don't we have too much stuff, or is it maybe not well written to be efficient? And so we try to make Odoo faster, and we've achieved with Odoo 12 to make some stuff faster. And this is the topic of the talk here. It's the creation of records with the methods called create. Actually, this is, you can think about that, this is the conclusion slide. It's a comparison of the time taken to import a CSV file with 2,500 partners. So this is the import time of a CSV. The red bar is the time taken by Odoo 11. The blue bar is the time taken by Odoo 12. Less is better. And you can see that Odoo 12 is much better. So I've been doing this on 2 different machines. If you wonder why somehow the speed up is different from one machine to another, actually on my laptop, what explains this kind of better speed up is the configuration of Postgres. It's essentially not really configured on my laptop, and therefore the run bot is actually better at handling queries, while mine is not. And the speed up comes from reducing the number of queries. And therefore, if you reduce the number of queries, that's always better for Postgres. And it shows up, let's say, more dramatically on my laptop because Postgres was not well configured. Okay? So the question is, how did we make some stuff like that? Essentially, we've been, it's actually quite recent, it's been 3 months or so, and we've made a few optimizations here and there. We've been profiling like hell to figure out where we could actually gain. We have essentially 4 different points. One was to try to make the create method work for batches of records. And the CSV file is the typical example where you have a bunch of records of the same model, and you want to create them as fast as possible, of course. So that you'd like to provide all that data to the create method, and it should do it right away that way. The second point here is about optimizing the way you determine which records have to be recomputed. So that's when you have computed fields on different records. So you're inserting new records, and suddenly those are, in fact, dependencies of some computed fields on other records. So you have to figure out what are those other records. And so we've speeded up the stuff by essentially generating less queries for figuring out those records, and also some Python improvements to mark the records to recompute faster. It's actually low-level profiling and trying to make some pathological cases work better. The third point is mostly anecdotal. It's essentially saving a few queries that were not really useful in the case of importing records. We're just saving a few queries, that's it, nothing more. And the last point is about, in fact, just an optimization about how we deal with, we write on one too many and many too many fields. If you know the way you write with a list of commands, and it's essentially the way we process those commands that has been improved a bit. Okay? So, for my talk, I have this typical example. You want to validate an invoice, and an invoice with many lines. So the typical case is you're making a purchase order to your provider, or you're yourself selling stuff to companies, and let's say you're selling shoes. So you're selling many shoes and stuff like that. And of course, your clients, which are resellers, shoe resellers, they want this model with this size, this size, this size, this size, and so on. And that makes, of course, invoices that are dead long. So you can have 1,000 lines in an invoice. When you validate that invoice, on some versions of Odoo, the request may simply time out before you can actually validate the invoice. So what I've been tracking in this use case, so we've been profiling what makes, in fact, the invoice validation so slow. And we realized that one of the bottlenecks was the creation of the account move lines. Essentially, the accounting related to the invoice, the move lines were actually the ones slowing down the validation. And for you to figure out what's going on with this invoice lines, with this account move line, sorry, I've shown you an extract of the log. I've been logging all the queries sent to the database. And those are all the queries sent for creating one account move lines. One account move line, sorry. And it makes 17 queries. 17. Of course, you multiply that by the number of lines, and it can quickly become terrible. Okay, just 100 lines, you're already around 2,000 queries. That's way too much, of course, to be scalable. If you look at those queries, you'll see 2 inserts, and then the rest is just selects. So the question is, what are those selects for? And are they really useful? Try to figure out. And, okay, how can we manage to get rid of them? Or at least to not do it every time we create an account move line. So the very first line is an insert. It's actually the insert creating the line in the table of account move lines. That one is necessary, okay? It's normal. The other insert, which is in the middle there, it's actually inserting a tuple in the relation between account move lines and taxes. This is for setting the many to many field that tells that on this line you have these taxes that apply. And the rest is what? Can you guess? Computed fields, yes. They are related to computed fields, in fact. Those select queries will, in fact, if you look at the log, the new line has the ID 24. And you can see that the ID 24 is used almost in all of those queries. And it actually figuring out, those selects are retrieving IDs from other tables that are connected in some way via some fields, to this new ID 24. And it's actually doing what? It's actually determining some records which have computed fields that have to be recomputed because those fields are stored in the database. So it's determining which records have to be recomputed, and then those records are marked and recomputed all at the end of the import. So the recomputation itself is not the most costly part. It's the determination of what has to be recomputed that is actually costly. So if you see in the code of the ORM, there's a method called modify, and essentially every time the ORM changes some fields, updates some fields on a record or on several records, it invokes this method, and this method will figure out which fields depend on the data that has been modified or just created, and it performs some search queries to determine which record have to be recomputed for those fields. So if I simplify, this is oversimplified, of course, but the idea is this one. We determine all the triggers. The triggers are the fields that depend on what we've done right now, the fields and the self. And they come together. The path parameter is, in fact, what connects what has to be recomputed with what has just been changed. Okay? So if you have a field that depends on partner ID.name, typically on the name field, they say there's a trigger for that computed field, and the path is partner ID. So you will look for the records of the first model for which the partner ID is the one you just modified or you just created potentially. Okay? So this is what generates all those select statements, almost all. In fact, the last 4 selects are for checking constraints written in Python. So this is just reading the data we've just created to check some values and so on. So those are constraints. Again, those constraints are done once for each new record. So when we realized what was going on, we thought, what if we remove computed fields? Maybe. That would have been a solution because we would remove plenty of code. And of course, executing no code is quite fast. But then we thought, okay, let's try the hard way now. Let's try to see whether we could somehow factor out those select queries. And let's put them and send those queries once for the whole batch of records we've created. That's the idea. And essentially, when we create a record, the code looks like the one on the left. So you determine a row to insert in the database. Then for that line you just created, you say, we have a bunch of fields, in fact, that are new. It's like they've been modified. So figure out what depends on these fields. And then also validate the fields that we've written to execute, in fact, the Python constraints related to that model and those fields. And essentially, the idea is that if this was the code of the method create, which would then perform a creation for several records at once, we could modify it to the right-hand side. And the right-hand side, essentially, it's moving the part that calls modified and validate constraints, which is the part which is issuing all those select statements, out of the loop. So they're done once for the whole batch of rows. Yeah, that's not correct. You're right. So indeed, the last line is, yeah, you say validate one row, but in fact you should somehow make a union of all the rows that have been set somehow. Thanks. It's a bug. But you see the idea. It's only an idea. It's not real executed code. But that's the idea behind the stuff. And when you do that, here is the result. Oh, yeah, cool. So this is the queries sent for creating all the lines. There were, in my example, 12 lines. So you see 12 inserts for creating the 12th line, and then the same select statements, but this time you can see when it's checking, you have move ID in and create move ID in. When you have stuff like ID in, it's not just one ID. It's in fact the IDs of all the new lines at once. So you first insert the stuff and you determine what depends on that batch, not every single row, but on the batch itself. And so you're somehow factoring out those select queries. And in this case, the way it's done, it's correct. It's only that, the idea. And I mean, it pays off. The result, of course, I'm going to show you some results. They may look disappointing, but this is the time here to validate an invoice with 20 lines. And the second one is the import of the thousands of partners. You have to realize that in this time, it's not just the time for creating lines. There's plenty of other business code. And in fact, there's a part, the part that creates the lines itself is something between, let's say, it's around 5 times faster. And in fact, the more lines you have, the faster you get somehow, because it scales well. The more you have, the more it scales, of course. And that's why you gain a lot. Be careful as well that when you see the import of partners, that doesn't look terrible, but the point is that the partners model is quite complex. And so there's much business code doing complex stuff behind there. And that's actually what takes the bulk of the execution. Now, so you can now have an idea of what create does inside. Now the point is, okay, how do I call create now? Because of course, you'd need a different way of calling create to say I want to create a batch of records and not just a single record. I've modified the API of create to take that into account. Okay, I'm the guy changing APIs all the time, so I'm quite used to that. The difference is here, before you called create with one dictionary of values and it creates one record. You can still call it like that. So it's still backwards compatible. That's important. But now you can call it with a list or any collection of dictionaries of values. And when you pass a list of dictionaries, it will in fact, for each dictionary, create one row in the database and perform all the business of determining the records to recompute for computed fields. Okay, that's the creation batch. Something nobody asked, I could actually, if you look at the insert queries, I could also have inserted all the lines with one query. In fact, in my when I was developing that, I did that stuff, but the gain was not, it was negligible. You don't get that much because that insert query is not that costly. it's not the most costly query, in fact, among all those 17 queries. So inserting in batch, you don't gain so much. But the other point is that if you have many lines to insert in one query, and let's say you have binary fields or fields with huge values, you may actually quickly end up into a pathological case because your query is huge and it's difficult to parse by Postgres. And that actually may, you can actually turn up something that looks like a clever optimization into something that's, let's say, prone to pathological cases. That's why I kept the insert one by one and only factored out the determination of computed records. So that's how you invoke create explicitly. If you want to take advantage of the optimization, and this is, for instance, what they've done in the accounting part. So the account move lines, they haven't called create like that. In fact, they created the account move lines simply by writing on the one-to-many of the account move, using those nasty little commands, and the command 0 is for creating a new line. So if you use those commands and you actually write a bunch of commands on the a one-to-many or a many-to-many field, in fact, behind the scenes, the parsing of those commands is actually putting all the records to create the values together and create them in one batch. So that's actually how we got somehow the optimization for free without changing the code. So if you can restructure your code simply by using those commands where it makes sense, you'll automatically get the optimization. Okay? So that's for calling the create method. For defining the create method, you got somehow the same kind of problems we had when we went from the old API to the new API. Remember version 8? We use decorators to figure out whether your definition of the create method is for a single record or a batch of records. And the decision that was taken is that the ones that were written like before, by default, are for a single record. So they expect a single dictionary and will create one record. And there's a magic wrapper that will deal with it. If you call it with a batch, essentially it will split the batch and call it one dictionary at a time and then make a record set with all the records it gets back. Okay? The second case is that I've defined a specific decorator for the create method. So it's called model create multi, because it's like the model, but for create in the multi-mode, which is the batch mode. And the only difference is that it expects to receive a list or a collection of dictionaries. That's what you have. And I've had long debates about how to name this parameter, because vals is already a plural. So I came up with vals list, which is a list, or in general, it may be a sequence or whatever of dictionaries of values. So essentially, so this one expects a list of such stuff. If you invoke that method with a single dictionary, in fact, it will simply be wrapped inside a list and then given to your method. Okay, so the wrapper does all the conversions which are need some adaptation, and inside, of course, you have to deal with those values and call super, hopefully with also a list of values. Yes. So the question is, does it matter if it's a list or a collection in general? In general, it may be any collection. At least the create method defined on the ORM itself accepts any collection. It may be a set won't work, but it may be a tuple, a list, or anything. So you can take the values of a dictionary and pass that So that's a view object in Python. It's a special collection. You can pass actually that one to the create method. Yes? Well, so the question is about the point is, so the question is, let me see if I rephrase correctly, wouldn't it be simpler to somehow try to optimize automatically by figuring out the type of the parameter? Actually, that's what the wrappers do. So we have wrappers. If you give the wrapper a single dictionary, a mapping, in fact, I'm checking whether it's a mapping. I'm using the mapping abstract class for that. Then it's a single case. And then if it's defined as a single case, I just pass the directory. If it's defined as a multi, I just wrap it inside a list. And the other way around, so if you pass a collection of dictionaries, so if it's not the mapping, then if it's defined for a collection, the argument is just passed. If the create method is defined for a single case, it will simply iterate over the argument and then call create for each one of them. So the wrapper is already doing the conversion when it's necessary. Something I did when I was testing this, I was suggested actually to maybe I could somehow include that stuff, is when I was calling a method in batch, but it was not defined in a batch, I was generating a warning in the log. So I could myself, when trying to do stuff, track which method was I calling and which was somehow under-optimal, suboptimal. So I could figure out where somehow to convert first. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yep. You can still define a create in the single case. It's not, nothing wrong will happen. It will simply not be possibly as efficient as it would with the multi-case. The point also is that adapting a create method defined for one record to a create method defined for several records at once, it can be tricky. There are some let's say, I found some simple patterns that are very easy to deal with. Is typically you first check the dictionary of values and you remove some fields, you add some fields, or you fix up some values in the dictionary, and then you pass it to a super call to create. That case is easy. Essentially, the manipulation of the dictionary, you do it in a for loop. So you iterate on all the dictionaries, and you do it on each dictionary, you modify it, and then you call the create. That's the easy case. But some are way more tricky than that. And then at some point, it becomes complicated when you create a bunch of records, and on each record, you have to do something different. It may become tricky to figure out how to somehow keep the connection between the initial values you've used for that record and do the right operation after the creation. So sometimes the overridden create are tricky to adapt to the batch case. But it might be worth it. Of course, it depends on the model. Okay, I can show you last, oh, yep. At the moment, it's only Odoo 12. As such, the code of the create method, you could backport it to version 10. But the point is, every time you override the method create, if you want to keep the optimization, you have to adapt that one as well. So backporting that to version 10 would be actually a huge work of going through every overriding of create to adapt it to the multi-case. And even here, for version 12, we haven't had the time yet to adapt all the create methods. I've actually somehow cherry-picked the ones that looked critical, but I haven't done all of them yet. But I've figured out which, of course, you want to tackle the important models. The problem there also, the ones that are business-wise the trickiest, that is partners, your contacts, your products, and that kind of stuff. And of course, the accounting and the stock as well. I'm not sure the stock is actually well adapted right now. So we still might actually get things better in the future. Yes?
I wonder if there is any limit to this batch. It's like really crazy, really heavy records like products, highly customized products. You single transaction is like really hard. So is there any like a limit?
So the question is there a limit on the batch you can save? There's no limit by such. Yeah, if you're ever anyway, if creating several thousands of records, you might yourself, if you're doing that in your code or in a script or something like that, if you already split them by, let's say, by 1,000, you got the job done. Okay, but so far, I mean, this shouldn't lead to so many dramatical cases. It should be fine with many records. Yes?
Like in the serial values commands is okay.
Yes.
Then sometimes you try to make a record set by calling new, and then just pass it to a one to make new. That will benefit from the same performance.
So the question is, could we replace the command 0, 0 something by a record made with the new method? At the moment, the new is not supported as a legal value, but it's only because of the format. But it might be feasible at some point to support the new record and to batch it just like a command, in fact.
You pass, for instance, harness.type IDs
Mm-hmm.
equals, and then a record set. So
A record set of new records and possibly all the records. At the moment, it doesn't work because the type does not fit, simply. But we could actually do it. Okay? Just wanted to show, this is my last slide, in fact. This is another optimization done by my colleague Xavier Morel. So he's been profiling like hell when the boss came and say, I have this CSV files of partners, I want to import it, it's too slow. So he started to figure out why was it slow, and it started fixing bit by bit all the stuff he came up to. So there was in fact, there was a kind of a something that didn't scale well in the too many fields. It's code I had written, and actually we've written in a better way to handle the insertion of many records. Then dealing with how you mark the records to recompute and stuff like that. One of them was just a stupid cache for the time zones. So when you have on partners, you have a selection field for time zone. Well, it turns out that for every time you need the whole selection, you were asking the system, give me the list of all time zones. So just putting a cache on that stupid stuff, there was a payoff of doing that. So if you look at the first lines, the gain doesn't look like much, but actually most of the time was taken here by company-dependent fields, the so-called property fields. And when we figured out how to optimize those, the gain was really, really huge. So here, essentially, it was just the implementation of setting company-dependent fields, which was not working in batch at all, and which was not benefiting from any kind of cache. So we've added a cache of the default values for the fields, and we managed to set them in batch, which wasn't done, in fact, for that case. For very obscure and technical reasons, it wasn't done in batch. And just by doing it in batch, we made something like, I don't know, it's more than 80% speed up, as you can see. So that's it. So I suggest let's go for lunch. I'll be around if you have more questions. Thank you.